a lot of people struggle to get information on, and there are advisory firms and there are HR consultancies, but it's nothing quite like talking to companies who've been there and done that and can share some of their thoughts and hopefully best practices. So we're going to be talking about attracting talent. We're going to be talking about how to build effective advisory boards, both business advisory boards as well as scientific advisory boards. And I'm really thrilled to have a terrific panel here this morning. So we're honored to have Joe Muldoon here from Fast Biomedical. He's Chief Executive Officer at Fast Biomedical, based out of Indianapolis, Indiana. He'll tell us a little bit more about himself and his career in just a moment. But a big thank you, Joe, for staying up very late for us. And I know you're off to vacation as well. So extra thanks to you and to your family for putting up with this at this late hour. So Fast Biomedical was in the MedTech Innovator US cohort last year. So an alumni from the US program. And then I have Alex Newton here, Chief Executive Officer of Navi Medical Technologies based out of Melbourne, Australia. Welcome, Alex. Great to see you again. And Navi, for those of you who don't know, was part of our MedTech Innovator Asia Pacific program. I believe it was last year in 2021. If I'm not mistaken. So what I'll do to begin with is have Joe and Alex briefly introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about your company and how you ended up in the role where you are at the moment, and then we'll dive into the topic of this morning. And I'll hand over to Joe first.
Good morning and good evening, everyone. Thank you, Frederick, for having me. I'm, I guess, what they call a serial entrepreneur now. I'm a business guy, E&Y trained CPA, managed their entrepreneurial services department, and then entered onto my own entrepreneurial journey. The first half of my career, I spent in broadband and wireless, which was a really good time to be in that field. And my colleagues were buying third homes and second boats, and I was making angel investments in life sciences companies. So I kind of got sucked into that world. I work with Fast Biomedical now. We're a late clinical stage company. We have a precision metric that guides decongestion therapy in acute decompensated heart failure patients. It has a pretty rare FDA expedited review and also a pretty rare harmonized approval trial path for both Europe and US.
Great, thanks very much, Joe, and Alex, please.
Yeah, hi everyone. Nice to be here today. My background is actually in engineering. I was an aerospace engineer and worked on and off for about a decade in the industry, predominantly in the US, and then some roles in Australia. I got more and more interested in technology commercialization and how an idea gets transferred into a product and then into the market. Studied a business degree at the University of Melbourne Business School, and that's where I met my co-founders. We went through a biodesign program, and I just became fascinated in MedTech. We started Navi in 2016 with the intention to commercialize a medical device to help neonatal and pediatric patients who were receiving central venous catheter insertion procedures. We're still on that journey of commercializing that product. So we're a pre-revenue company, but we have a product that's being used in the clinical setting in studies, and we've recruited about 100 patients into our studies to date.
Great, thanks for that, Alex. And maybe I'll start by asking you in a more general terms about your view on best practices for a successful recruitment process, and if there are some best hires that you can think back on over your careers, what made that recruitment process particularly successful? And Joe, maybe I'll turn to you first.
Thanks, Frederick. I think our premise we start with is you're always raising capital and you're always recruiting talent. whether you have a round open or not, or whether you have a position open or not, that capital and talent are the two critical components of your business. And so you have to be working on them every day. So when I look at people that we've recruited, many of them, I was recruiting them for 2 or 3 years and they just didn't realize it. Like, I knew we didn't have a position for them at the moment, but I thought they were spectacular and that we eventually would. A specific example, per your request, is we were working with an intern at Rose Holman Ventures. She was spectacular. She was working on some device prototypes and she was getting ready to graduate. And so I went to our management team and said, well, we must hire her. And they were, well, it's not the point in our business plan where we need another biomedical engineer. And my reaction was, I'm not going to go chase her down 2 years from now and try and talk her out of a good job. We're just going to hire her now and figure out all the rest. And we hired her. And like 2 weeks into her employment, we were all like, how did we ever get anything done without her? Because I think when you find the right talent, they not only take care of important things that you knew about, but important things that maybe you weren't thinking about yet.
Good point. And Alex.
Yeah, I think we had a similar experience, but maybe at the advisory level. We went to a conference and met up with somebody who was just incredible and sort of set in place the goal to bring that person onto our board of directors. Well, and initially it was an advisory position and then onto our board of directors. But again, they didn't know about that. And so over the course of a couple of years, we kind of progressed that relationship to the point that we made that happen. I think one thing that I've found is that the hiring process is a little bit of an art and there's a little bit of a science to it. So being an engineer, we like, our team is predominantly engineers. We like to be very methodical about the process, but at some point you have to realize that when you're bringing people into the company, there's the human factor to that. And, it's difficult to put a process around that and numbers around that. Sometimes it's just a gut feel. So that's an important part of the process.
Right. And Alex, I'll stay with you here. How has COVID now affected recruitment and retaining employees? And are you all back at the office? Are people still working from home? And how do you manage some of those changes around the pandemic?
Yeah, it's been an interesting process. I think I was a little bit more concerned than I needed to be about the working from home situation. We put in place measures like every company did for working from home, and we tried to maintain the culture. Something that's very important to us is that everyone really loves working together. It genuinely is a really nice place. And we want to create the atmosphere that people want to come to work. So when we couldn't, hang out together at work, have a coffee and that sort of things, we tried to replace that as far as possible as we could with online activities. We would actually just schedule time to have a coffee and catch up. Today we're predominantly back at work. Okay. We have 1 day a week where we're working from home, but that's just more, I think something that we found over the COVID period was working from home gives us a little bit of an opportunity to balance the life admin aspects of things. Some of our founders now have kids, so that helps with the childcare responsibilities. So we're trying to be flexible, but I think nothing really beats the collaborative working together on a problem and solving it face to face. And I think especially at our stage when there's a lot of creativity that is required, it's very difficult to beat working together.
Makes sense. How has it affected Fast Biomedical, Joe?
We're still learning. I think we were ahead of the curve because we had been working with medical advisors from around the world. So like we were Zoom proficient before anybody else was, and we knew how to work with people remotely. but our core team, we'd always been together. We'd always been in the same place. And when we went to work remotely, it worked well. And I'm not still sure how much of that was because we'd already built a culture and we'd already built a reservoir of relationships with which we could draw upon when we were working remotely. But so far, so good. Right before the pandemic hit, we hired a very senior regulatory person, and he was based in Dallas. We gave him a relocation package to Indianapolis, and I said, "Look, you don't need to move right away. Take a year, make sure you get the school system right with your kids." And 3 months in, I called him and I said, "What you've taught me is you don't need to be here. You're killing it. We're getting everything done. You come see us once every couple months, and that's enough. You don't need to live here." So I think we're still learning. I've been thrilled, frankly, with how smoothly it's gone. What I'm not sure of yet is how much of it went smoothly because we already had these existing relationships with each other, or we saw each other every day. And I think that will be proven out over time. And I think we still need to find times to get together. I think there's a face-to-face component that can't be replaced.
For sure. And I think we're all seeing that now as conferences start to happen in person again. Everyone's just very excited to get together and start to meet people they haven't seen for a couple of years. Excellent. Let's talk a little bit more about the actual recruitment process. Are each of you typically personally involved in the recruitment of most of the positions within your companies? Have you personally gone out to find candidates, or do you work with an external search agency or recruitment firm, and is that something that you did from the beginning of the development of your organization, or is that something that you've only started to do more recently? And Alex, maybe I'll ask you first.
Yeah, I am directly involved in every position that we hire, but I think that's because we're a small team. So we've got 8 employees. We've got then 3 independent directors and 3 advisors, and we're growing our advisory board. So I have been involved in every stage. I like that. I recognize that that there's a time requirement that you need to meet for that. It does take time to interview people, but I think going back to what Joe said, there's 2 things I think that are critical: raising capital and getting the right people on board. And at this point in the journey of our company, I don't feel like I want to set that aside. So yeah, I would like to remain involved in that process. As mentioned, we've got a very structured process to do that. We haven't used executive sort of recruitment firms to date. We've been able to identify the positions that we need from within our own networks or sort of advertising in the local area. But I recognize that as our journey gets closer to market entry, and then from market entry into scale, the skills that we require will change. And so I'm recognizing that we may need to use that sort of executive search firm in the future.
Right. And Joe, your thoughts on that, your level of involvement with, and maybe the size of your organization as well, if you can share that with us.
Yeah, part-time and full-time. We're a small shop. We've got a couple dozen people, but I am intimately involved with recruiting and hiring. But I'm old, so I've done a lot of other things. And the largest company I ever ran was 1,000 employees. And I was intimately involved with recruiting and hiring because I could never find anything that was more important to do than to get the human capital piece right. If you get the human capital piece right, everything else becomes easier. And so I was intimately involved with it then. So yeah, we're involved. In our current company, we've not used executive recruiters. We're considering that. Right now, we're working with a couple that have impressed us. There have been several others that haven't impressed us. In my previous life, when I was running 1,000-person company, we did work with executive recruiters and had a pretty good result. But so far in our current company, we've recruited everybody ourselves, and usually it's been like a 2 to 3 year process where we identify who we're going to need well down the road and start figuring out who might be able to fill that need now, and getting to know them.
Right. And Joe, maybe I'll stay with you here. What are some common hiring mistakes that you have come across, or red flags when recruiting, and what are some of the ways that a small startup can avoid some of these mistakes?
We and I've been told this again and again by candidates, compared to others, we spend a ridiculous amount of time on it. I tell people, at the end of this process, you're going to feel over interviewed, and the person to blame is me. And it's because I really don't like to fire people. Like I envision myself going to your retirement party, and I think getting this decision right is more about me than it is about you. And so it's kind of really committing to that process. Red flags. We've had some unfortunate incidents over the years where just people thought they were entrepreneurs until they tried to be entrepreneurs, and then realized that without a staff, they were just not comfortable, and they were not in their element. So most of the kind of misfires have been along the lines of, we hired somebody that came from a big corporate environment. They'd only been in a big corporate environment. They thought entrepreneurship sounded really exciting, and then it just wasn't a good fit, because a lot of times, as all of you know, in an entrepreneurial shop, you are your staff, right? Like you get to clean off the sidewalk and then walk in the door and do everything else, and they're just not accustomed to doing that. So we try and look for people that have had maybe a little bit of entrepreneurial experience and some failures. My favorite candidate is somebody that's failed at something, because once you fail at something, you realize you can't. And when you've only been successful, you think maybe you can't fail, but you can fail. Yeah.
That's good advice, and I think particularly for here in Asia Pacific, where failure is not always viewed the same way it is in the US and elsewhere. Alex, any hiring mistakes you've come across, or red flags, or things to watch out for?
I think that was great advice by Joe. The red flag that I've had twice in the past was people that were maybe a little pushy to get onto our advisory boards, or at the time it was more an advisory panel. That just didn't sit right with me, and I'm glad that I trusted that instinct. The people that I think have been the most helpful have been the people that have really bought into the vision of what we're trying to do early, and initially weren't even interested. Like, there was no discussion around compensation initially, and I realized that that only lasts. It's only fair to take advantage of that for a short period of time, but and at some point, you need to make it fair. But that's I think that gives you the ability to develop the relationship, figure out, is there really a cultural fit? How does that person really fit into the company? And then you can talk about the sort of compensation. Now that kind of works in that advisory role piece. In the direct hires, some of the mistakes that I've seen made have been on not really defining or articulating exactly what the need is within the business. So the definition of that role sometimes hasn't been good. And at the other end of the spectrum, so the way that we think about it is you've got to define it, advertise for the role, screen, interview, select, and then onboard that person and kind of help them succeed. And so I think there's been some failures at the definition phase, but also on the onboarding. With our first round of recruitment, we didn't do that onboarding very well. And I noted that there was a question in the Q&A about this. We really make an effort on that onboarding part now. We pair people up in the company with a buddy, so somebody who's in their kind of area of domain expertise that they can learn from initially, but then we also pair them with a mentor. So somebody who's in a completely other part of the business, who's just there to make sure that they're having a good time and that culturally they're feeling like they fit in. And I think that's a good way to kind of build networks within the team as well. So we really try to make sure that that's it's not a process of just, hey, welcome to the company, there's your seat, do your work. You know, we're really trying to get people to feel like a part of the family, I suppose.
Right. To what extent do your investors get involved in the recruitment process, and to what extent can you tap on their networks, maybe for talent, for senior positions? And Alex, I'll stay with you on this one, perhaps.
To date, we haven't really reached out to our investors. That's probably because really largely we've been sort of funded through angels and high net worths at the moment. We do have a VC on our books. We've talked to them about that, and they've said, if you really need help, we're happy to talk about it. But to date, we haven't really had to use that.
Okay.
So, but I think it's a great resource. Like, why wouldn't you ask your investor network if you're after a key skill or a key kind of hire?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Joe, your thoughts on involving investors?
We've found the investor network to be a very useful and credible resource for recruiting talent, and then even more so our board of directors, which of course there's some overlap because a lot of our board has seats because of their investment, but we found it to be a particularly effective way to recruit, because these are people that are already bought into the vision, they're already bought into the unmet medical need. They've got a network that's way beyond your own. So yeah, we found that useful.
Very good. And we'll come to talk about compensation in a bit more detail here in just a moment. But I did want to ask you, when you're looking to, or when a startup venture is looking to attract experienced domain experts and leaders in early stages of the company, while at the same time, of course, trying to operate as capitally efficient as you can. How does a startup grapple with that? Is it simply a matter of providing equity as opposed to cash salaries, or are there other ways to make your business stand out and attract those types of individuals? And Joe, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, I've made every mistake in the book in that regard, but I think what I've learned the hard way is you want the best people, and the best people already understand what market is, and you need to be prepared to pay them market, or you're going to get less than the best people. And yes, it's a challenge because you're capital starved, but you know what? I'm the CEO, so it's my job to raise enough capital to be able to attract and then compensate the best people. It's not very difficult to understand what market compensation is for board directors. There's the Cooley reports, there's the spacing the name of the other group that does it in life sciences. I mean, that data is available, and the people that you really want already know what that data is, and they're probably already serving on a couple other boards, whether it's board of directors or scientific advisory board. And my advice is pay market, and if you pay below market, you're going to get below market results.
Alex, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, our experience has probably been to lean a little more heavily on the ESS or ESOP, so the employee share option pool. Again, initially, I think for the key sort of advisory positions, those relationships were built around sort of the vision and getting support and sort of getting advice from these people, building the relationship, and transitioning from sort of an informal relationship where there was some pro bono work going on into a more formal sort of advisory position, and then ultimately onto the board of directors. As our company transitioned, initially we had a board that was the founders so kind of the management team was also the board of directors, but over time we sort of, some people stepped down and we brought some independent people on board. So yeah, we offer equity and cash, so
Yep.
equity and salary. That's probably a function of the fact of how much we're able to hire. Sorry, how much we're able to raise at this stage of our company. But into the future, I think it would be, I would agree. You want to pay market rates or above to attract and retain the best positions.
Yeah, and Alex, do you provide equity at all levels, or is it just your senior management team, or how does that work?
At the moment, it is not at all levels. So yeah, it's not at all levels. So for the key positions that we just can't live without, I think that's the positions that we've offered equity to. There's a discussion at the moment actually around what other positions might be eligible for the ESS. So we're open to that discussion.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit more about compensation and particularly the ESOP, the employee share option or share ownership plan. And Joe, I'll turn to you maybe first on this. When is a good time for a startup to implement something like that? Is it from day one? Is it a bit later on in the development? Should you make it available to everyone, or should you take the approach maybe that Alex just outlined? What are your thoughts on best practices in managing ESOP?
We don't do an ESOP, but we do give an equity incentive, and we give it to everybody that's involved in the business at all levels. We generally use incentive stock options, so you're getting an option that you can buy at today's valuation, and as the valuation of the company grows and the valuation of the share grows, you can buy shares at the valuation of the day that you were given them. That's been a pretty effective retention and rewarding tool. And when we recruit people, I say you could, we'll pay you competitively. You could probably go somewhere and make more in cash. Nobody will give you a bigger equity incentive than I will. And more importantly, nobody will give you the chance to do things that are different than I will, right? Like failure is not fatal here. We'll let you try lots of different hats and see which ones fit and which ones that you like and which ones don't. And if they don't fit, that's okay. Like failure isn't fatal here.
Yeah. But you would give this to all your employees at all levels then?
We do. I mean, it's obviously different by level, but yeah, we like,
of course,
we like everybody to have an equity incentive. And my rule has always been violent alignment of interest with shareholders.
Yeah.
Nothing that violently aligns the interest of everybody that's working in your building with shareholders, that they have shares to hold. That they're very interested in how the value of those shares increases over time, and I think that's a healthy thing.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. The other challenge, of course, in terms of motivating teams, especially during the early days, is avoiding burnout and keeping morale up during difficult times. And a lot of startups seem to be a bit understaffed and a bit overworked. Alex, what are some of the ways that you keep morale up with your team?
Yeah.
Other than the share options.
Yeah, I think, look, there is a recognition that the startup world, even at the early stages, it's a difficult game to be in. And I think, the first thing is just to be transparent about the amount of work that's required. Our team is probably overutilized, maybe a little bit understaffed, but it's kind of at a comfortable level. I know that sounds weird, but we've kind of gotten to the point that we can manage that level of utilization. And, it's important to keep a bit of a, check on the pressure levels. And again, I think that's easy to do when you're working face to face. It's more difficult to do that when sort of working from home over Zoom calls. I don't know, just little things like to build a good culture, things like I like to surprise people every now and then, just say, hey, we're going to take a long lunch and go and do something fun, or just to sort of break up the sort of expectations around. I'm going to be sitting at my desk for 8 hours a day. No, let's go and do something a little bit different. So that's one way just to kind of keep the workplace a little bit interesting. We do have sort of regular feedback sessions where we can talk about, how are people feeling within the company? And I think just be really transparent about it. Be open, like actually explicitly get people to tell you how they're feeling. Don't let it kind of bubble away for too long and wait for the volcano to erupt, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Your thoughts on this, Joe?
So maybe the thing I'm most proud of in my career is the ridiculously high retention rate of our employees. And I think it's a couple things, and it's a formula, and we're still figuring out the formula, but culture matters. Culture matters. Like what culture do you hold yourself accountable to? And do you articulate and you attract people that embrace that culture, and you repel people that don't embrace that culture? Because really good, really capable, really hardworking, really accountable people want to work with people that are just like themselves. And why they get frustrated and why they leave other businesses is because they're not working with the people the same caliber they are, or those people aren't held to the same standards they are. So we focus on that. We focus on transparency. This startup stuff is kind of scary, right? And I always felt that fear of the unknown is greater than fear of the known. So when we have team meetings, I'm like, here's how much cash we have. Here's how I'm doing on our next raise. And I like, most of the meeting is me holding myself accountable to them for doing my job, which they should be comfortable holding me accountable. And then I let them know, the biggest component of my job is making this the best place you could ever imagine working. And you need to let me know when I'm not doing my job. And I just check in with them on a regular basis. Frederick, how are you doing? Do you have all the resources you need? Do you feel like, are you more energized or more burned out? And just like making sure it's a priority that your people, which should all be great people, feel energized and empowered, and that they're listened to, and that they have a voice. And I think CEOs need to spend more of their time doing that, like more of their time doing that and less of their time doing everything else. Because if you get the right team that's energized and motivated and retained, everything else kind of takes care of itself.
I think that's great advice, and probably not advice that our audience on this webinar necessarily hear every day. So that's very helpful. I want to talk briefly about diversity as well. And as I was browsing Navi's website and looking at your team, Alex, you got an incredibly diverse team in terms of gender and ethnicities and so on. We usually take diversity for granted when we work in a multinational. And is diversity something that matters for a small company? And do you, Alex, go out of your way to ensure that you got a diverse team?
Yeah, it matters. Yes, we talk about diversity and the strengths that you can get from diversity, and maybe not in the ways that people think about. So yes, we've got sort of a gender diversity, a cultural diversity, but the other thing that I think is really important is we've got career stage diversity. So we have people that are, we've our most recent hire, a little bit like Joe, our most recent hire was a biomedical engineer who's just about to graduate, came in for an internship and was fantastic. And we said, we can't afford to let this guy go. So we made them an offer while they're still studying, and they'll transition out of studying into a job. And so that's a great position to be in. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got people that have been in the business for 30, 35 plus years. And then there's people like myself in the middle who have had a previous career for 10 to 12 years, have decided to make a change, so bring an experience. So I think there's an incredible amount of value from diversity across the board, but in areas that people might not sometimes think about. I think initially we didn't go out and sort of build a founding team with the intention of having it diverse. So it's only been something that we've really recognized the strength of in retrospect, but from now onwards, we recognize that that's an important part of what makes the culture within Navium like so good and so fun to work in. And so actually, yeah, for probably the last 18 months, we've been talking about ways that we can, build that into the DNA of the company. And we have a diversity policy in place. We talk about it. It's important to us.
Yeah. Great point. And for the audience, of course, I recognize the fact that we don't have a particularly diverse panel today, but it varies from week to week. I do apologize for that. Joe, your thoughts on diversity?
The diversity I found most useful is diversity of thought. And usually diversity of experience drives diversity of thought, and there's all different ways to get there. Going back to our biomedical engineer that we hired as an example, when we were hiring her and I was recruiting her, I said, if you take this job, you're going to be the youngest person here. You're going to be a female engineer in a male dominated company. And if you come here and get in line, shame on you. Like, shame on you. Like, don't get in line. Like, come bring it. Like, tell us when we're wrong. Tell us when I'm full of it. And boy, did she embrace that challenge. I'm like, if you're not doing things that are probably making me uncomfortable at times, you're probably not pushing the envelope far enough. And she's pushed the envelope far enough. So we really value diversity of thought and diversity of experience. And if everybody agrees with you, you've probably got the wrong team.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, I wanted to talk about advisory boards for a few minutes. There is, of course, the legal board of directors that everyone needs, and we'll speak about scientific advisory boards and in just a moment. Is there an optimal size from your perspective on this? Are there? I don't know in the US if there are any specific legal requirements, or in Australia legal requirements on this. How many seats do you typically give to some of your key investors in earlier round? Do you need to add independent directors early on, or is that something you can add later as the company progresses? So if we just focus on the board of directors at the moment, how to what extent are you able to influence the composition of that and the numbers and who gets represented there? And maybe Joe, I'll turn to you first.
Well, it's a negotiation every round, right? Mm-hmm. Like, so your new investors are going to have strong opinions on us if they get a seat, how many seats they get.
And it's usually in the term sheet already spelled out, isn't it?
Right. It's a negotiation, and the best way to negotiate is to have options.
Yeah.
One of the things we did early on that I guess was unique was some of our early investors wanted board seats, and I said, yeah, you can have a board seat as long as you own X% of the shares. And the minute you own less than X% of the shares, because we've raised more money and we've brought on more investors, then that sunsets, and now you're sitting at the pleasure of the shareholders, which means they can reelect you or not.
Right.
Numbers, I've seen a pretty wide disparity. I've been on probably 20 boards of directors now, and I've seen a wide disparity of numbers that are effective, from probably 30 to 15. I tend to like less. I'm kind of more like a 5 to 7 guy.
Yeah.
Some of the best practices is always have an odd number so there can be a tie break in votes.
Good point.
I think that's less important, frankly. If your board's not mostly agreeing on strategy, you're in trouble, right? Like, if things are coming to tie-breaking votes, there's a real big problem in the business. So yeah, get an odd number if you can, but it's not that huge of a deal at any given point in time if you can't.
Yeah.
And it's a negotiation with your investors.
Good point. Alex, your thoughts on?
I think my key point of advice would be keep it simple to start with, and to recognize that it will change over time and be open to that change. We've also got certain equity thresholds written into our shareholders agreement. So if somebody has a certain number of shares, they're eligible for a seat on the board. And initially we started off with 6 co-founders, and we were all co-founders, and that was the board of directors. Over time, we developed an advisory board, and then we decided that some of those people were so good and that we enjoyed working with them that we would like to bring them into the board of directors. So 3 of the co-founders stepped out of the board, and we brought on 3 independent directors, a chairman, and one of them was an investor. And that was a fantastic process. Actually, I was a little bit hesitant about, having the discussion with some of my co-founders about taking a step back from the board, but I think we recognized that was what we needed to do for the company to take the next step and get the governance and the feedback required at that point. And we're aware that moving forward, we might need to reshuffle the board. And we're in the process now of splitting out and growing our advisory board as well. So, you're kind of in an ever-changing entity. Keep it as simple as you can to start off with, and change it over time as needed.
Right. Good insights there. And Alex, you have a independent from your board of directors. You have a scientific advisory board as well, I believe. Some companies choose to have a scientific advisory board and a business advisory board separate from the board of directors, so effectively 3 boards. Does that make sense? Is that something that you have or you've come across? What are some of the pros and cons of that? And maybe I should also ask, at what point in time in the development of a startup should you be looking at setting up a scientific advisory board? Alex, sorry. So I kind of take a step back and think about what are the risks, what's the risk profile of your company, and maybe try and align the advisory board with the risk profile of your company. I think in a lot of startups, initially you've got this great idea and you're not sure if it'll work technically or scientifically, and so you're trying to validate the technical aspect of that initially. You're trying to get problem solution fit. Right.
The solution address the problem. And I think that's where a technical or a scientific advisory board can be really helpful. As that develops and you're starting to reduce the technical risk, the risk that starts to bubble up is the commercial and market risk. And, you definitely don't want to leave it too late. But as you're starting to squash the technical risks and your thinking naturally transitions more towards the commercial side of things, I think that's a good time to bring on some of the commercial advisors. Having said that, two of our scientific advisory members are also very experienced in the MedTech industry and are giving us commercial advice. So I don't think it's necessarily one or the other, but I think it's just a little bit more of a focused sort of discussion around the sort of technical risks initially and then the commercial risks. Right.
Thanks for that. And Joe, your thoughts on scientific versus business advisory boards?
I think you need both, and they have very different roles. Like our scientific advisory board initially was just scientific people that worked in the business. We didn't call them an advisory board because Alex is spot on, right? Your challenges earlier, can you get this to work? What I would submit is more companies are killed, not because it doesn't work, but because nobody needs it after it does work, that it doesn't have a unique fit in the market, kills more companies than the technology didn't work. So what we have is our medical advisory boards. So these are folks that are not focused on the science of our technology and whether it works, but what's standard of care today? What's the clinical use scenario? What are the health economics that you're going to need to meet? What are the medical outcomes that you're going to need to meet to be viable? And they're a very, very important component of what we do. I think you need all of them. You need good scientific advice, you need good medical advice, and you need good business advice. And as Alex said, it's kind of it's different during the life of your business.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Thanks for that. And of course, the immediate follow-up question now is, how do you best compensate your boards? What's the optimal way of compensating KOLs maybe that sit on your medical or scientific advisory board, or people that sit on a business advisory board and maybe meet only four or six times a year or something like that? Is it cash? Is it a monthly retainer? Is it a bit of equity? Do you expect them to do this pro bono? Joe, your thoughts on that first.
We don't expect them to do it pro bono. I mean, we talk to a lot of people that are interested in the space, and the conversations don't cost anything, right? Like they're leaders in the space. We're trying to keep them updated on what we're doing. They give you some useful insights. If the relationship's more than that, if we're spending a lot more of their time on the medical advisory, it's cash compensation. A lot of times they don't want equity, right? Because there's a different level of disclosure requirement that they have to make, which might negatively influence their perception in the marketplace. So a lot of times it's just kind of cash compensation for our medical advisors. For our board of directors, it's a mix of equity and cash compensation, trying to put it as heavy towards equity as they'll let us get away with, frankly. But there still needs to be a cash component.
Yep. Thanks for that. Alex, what's your situation in Australia?
Yeah, a similar experience, and as I've mentioned a couple of times, you know, we've lent heavily on the ESS initially, the ESOP or the shares.
Yep.
And after, you know, we've now done a couple of rounds of funding. We do pay some of the, you know, board costs. Not so much on the advisory side at the moment, but that may change as we're building out our advisory panel. So again, you got to be open to that. I think it really goes back to what Joe said. You know, you can't expect to get the best advice for free. There's got to be an equity, a balance there. I mean.
Yeah, makes sense. Very often we see companies, especially with very innovative technologies, with very heavyweight board or scientific advisory board, very impressive, but sometimes underutilized. What's the best way for a startup to make sure that you maximize the value of your advisory boards, whether scientific or business boards? Joe.
We've not always gotten this right, because you're absolutely right. I think what I've learned is, you know, originally we'd try and start out and have these every other month or these quarterly meetings or twice a year meetings, and these gentlemen and women are so busy and they've got so much going on. It's excruciatingly difficult to get them all in the same place at the same time. So then we pivoted to, okay, what medical conferences will most of them be at? And we'll attend those and get most of them that we can in the room. But a lot of it is just one-on-one updates, one-on-one, keeping them informed. Here's where we are. Here's where we think we need to go next. Does that make sense? What do you think? What do we need to do to validate that? And what we found was, even though it was more time inefficient from our standpoint, meeting with 6 people individually, it got it done a lot quicker, and it was more time efficient for them. And frankly, we need to be more time efficient for them. Like we have more flexibility than they do. They're the key opinion leaders that everybody wants on their medical advisory board. So you got to figure out, you know, when they're going to be available and where they're going to be available. Then you just have to be there, and give them an update and get their input.
Great point. And Alex, how do you maximize the value of your boards?
Yeah, we have quarterly board meetings, and I think to date, actually, there's only been one meeting where one of the independent directors wasn't able to attend, but to date, very good attendance, and that's good. That's a really helpful forum for discussion, and to get advice. With our chairman, we have a weekly call. Just it's half an hour. Sometimes there's not a lot to cover. Sometimes we go way over that time. And with another sort of key independent director who is sort of a KOL in this space. Again, we have a weekly half an hour call, and you know that's gold. That call is really helpful. Helps us gather, intelligence on what's going on in the market in the US, helps us understand, what are the trends in the clinical space doing. All sorts of really helpful information there. The other thing I would say is, we do bring our advisors and some of our directors in as needed on some really important decisions. So right. We have out of sessions meetings when there's a key decision to be made. We make sure that we send through briefing papers at least a week in advance, give people time to review it, and then set those meetings. And it can be a real challenge to find a time when everyone's available, especially when we're working across 3 time zones. But we make it work, just like this meeting's across 3 time zones. It's possible.
Yeah. Good feedback. Thanks for that. I'm conscious of time. We have about 7 or 8 minutes left. For those of you in our cohort, do feel free to input your questions into the Q&A function of your Zoom interface, and we'll get to those after the full hour. I want to talk briefly about what happens when you start really scaling your business. So typically after a fairly significant fundraise, let's say a 10 million or a 20 million fundraise, the investors will normally expect the CEO to scale fairly quickly, expand the team maybe at multiple levels, maybe open additional offices or even make small acquisitions. At that point in time, what are some of the challenges, and maybe how do the leadership skills change, because they will probably be quite different from the very early days when the company was being set up. And I'll turn to Joe first on this, because I know you've done a few startups and you may have been through this process.
Boy, that's a great question. It depends. I've run big companies and I've run small companies, and what I learned was when you run a big company and there's a hiring decision that ends up not being a fit, it's painful. When you run a small company and there's a hiring decision that's not a fit, it can be fatal. Because the smaller your team is, you sometimes don't have time to recover from that mistake. So it's a balance, because all of a sudden there's money and now you get to deliver on all these promises you made of rapid growth. And you got to keep a little bit of a governor on that, because your ability to make the right recruiting and hiring decisions, and then maybe more importantly, be committed to the success of the people that you just brought on. Like the mindset I don't care for is, well, we'll bring them in here, and if they're not performing, then we'll shove them out. We'll bring somebody else in. It's like, no, like, we hired them? What did we get wrong? What did we get wrong in our evaluation? What did we not provide in a resource? What did we not commit to them to be successful? So our mode has always been more like, no, once we hire somebody, we're committing to their success. And if they fail, it's more of a reflection on me than it is on them, because we got to make the decision, right? So it's a great question. You have to do it. You have to execute. You have to execute on the commitments you made, but you got to keep a little bit of a governor on it, so that you're not trying to slam people into your organization and forget the culture and forget the commitment to making them successful. Because I think ultimately you're going to get a better result if you don't do that.
Great insights. Thanks for that, Joe. Alex, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can comment authoritatively after a 20 mil raise. I hope to be there soon,
If
but
you were to look forward,
yeah, I think that's what I was going to suggest. I think one thing that I'm aware of is, look, I think I'm the right person to lead this company at this stage of development, and luckily I've got the support of everybody around me to do that. But I recognize that as the company grows and as we get closer to market and in market, the set of skills required, as you correctly identified, shifts.
Mm.
And the one thing that I'm committed to more than anything is success of the business, not necessarily the letters that are after my name. If I have to go down into a different role or take a different position, that's okay. And I think you want to be comfortable with that. If you really care about the business, you should be comfortable with that. So we're already thinking about my position in the company, as in years
Right.
into the future. Should I grow into that role, or should we bring somebody else in? And
Yeah.
we're talking about that. So
Yeah.
I think people who are maybe listening in, try to decouple the emotion of the letters after your name and what that means. Take a step back, think about what really matters is the commercial success of the startup.
Great advice there, Alex. Really appreciate that. We are close to the hour. Before we wrap up with our YouTube audience and move on to Q&A here, I'll ask each of you to just share if you have any final thoughts on the subject, any final tips, advice, reflecting on today's conversation. And also if any of the companies want to contact you, is it all right that we share your email address with the cohort companies? And Joe, I'll turn to you first for some closing words on this.
Sure. Well, happy to share my email. I have drank from many wells that I have not dug, and so I'm always happy to talk to people.
Thank you.
We're kind of all in this together. As far as advice, I'm going to just bolt on to the last topic you talked about growth. To my fellow CEO brethren, you will find it much easier to justify slightly lower than planned great success and execution than rapid as planned sloppy failure. Right? So you just got to kind of harness, you got to put a governor on the push to do it quickly. You still have to do it quickly, but focus more on doing it right than doing it quickly, because you'll be forgiven for being a little bit slower and executing brilliantly than being right on schedule and having sloppy failure.
Very true. Very true. Great advice. Thanks for that, Joe. Alex?
Yeah, again, happy to be contacted. I think my advice would be, something that we've learned is when you're screening applicants in your recruitment process, we tend to screen for the technical skills, but then interview for the cultural fit. And there's nothing, I think, more important. I would rather have somebody who has a great attitude, ability to learn quickly, doesn't quite meet the expected experience level, but it's just a great cultural fit.
Very good advice. Gentlemen, we are on the hour. Thank you both so very much for taking the time and sharing your insights and allowing our audience to get a much better understanding of what it really takes to run a company and to bring talent in and to manage that talent to grow the business. Joe, special thanks to you. I know it's really late for you. I will ask you to stay on for a while. We're going to just part ways with our YouTube audience, so don't hang up quite yet. But I wanted to extend my thanks to both of you. Bear with us. We have a few more questions to go. I will pause here for a minute, and Ferda can disconnect us from YouTube. Thank you so much to our YouTube audience for being with us. And we'll move over to Q&A.